You couldn't make a movie like Forrest Gump today. Mostly because if you tried, people would say, that's just Forrest Gump, we already did that. And then the studios would probably not make it. But they did make it once. Director Robert Zemeckis and writer Eric Roth's Forrest Gump premiered on July 6, 1994, adapting Winston Groom's novel of the same name, with Tom Hanks starring in the title role as a Southern man with a low IQ whose misadventures take him through the most formative moments of the United States in the middle of the 20th century. And when it was released, Gump was a massive hit, making $678 million worldwide, winning 6 Academy Awards, and becoming one of the defining films of the 90s. But now, 30 years later, it seems like Gump is a more divisive film than ever. Forrest Gump, the movie, is, at its heart, a baby boomer fantasy. Now, don't take that the wrong way. I know that boomer is used like an insult these days, but what I'm talking about is the actual baby boomer generation, who, at the time of the movie's release, were settling into a period of great nostalgia as the majority of the workforce and political constitution of the United States. Gump is also an extremely political movie, but maybe not in the ways you're thinking. By political, I don't mean the way the term is often used today, as in pushing a political agenda, but in that the story is intertwined with the political evolution and upheaval of the US. Is Forrest Gump a conservative nostalgia trip into America's past? Is it a sly satire that critiques the country's unending internal and external conflicts? Is the movie actively trying to not take any specific side in the many massive geopolitical moments it depicts? To all of these and more, I would say, yes. Love it, hate it, forgot about it, watch it all the time. I think it's a fascinating piece of nostalgia chronicling 30 years, that in and of itself has become a nostalgic artifact 30 years later. Let's take a look at the baby boomer historical fantasy of Forrest Gump, and its strangely complicated legacy. Forrest Gump first came to life in 1986 in the novel named after its lead character, written by Winston Groom. But it didn't make much of an impact at the time. Groom's novel received tepid reviews and sold 30,000 copies in its hardback run. However, producer Wendy Feinerman and Warner Brothers soon purchased the rights and hired Groom to write the screenplay. But when the movie Rain Man was released in 1988, which also follows a neurodivergent man on a journey, the studio lost interest. Eventually, Eric Roth heavily rewrote the script, and Paramount Pictures went on to purchase it under the continued guidance of Feinerman. With actor Tom Hanks, a new movie star after Sleepless in Seattle and Philadelphia, and director Robert Zemeckis, having already made the Back to the Future trilogy, soon signed on. Forrest Gump is about as 90s as a 90s movie can get. I'm not talking about fashion or music or style, but this blend of broad market appeal in a movie's tone meets frequent adult situations that aren't really meant for the kids being brought in by the family marketing, meets heavy political content that deeply informs the plot. The 1990s were filled to the brim with politically focused films, ranging from political thrillers like the Jack Ryan movies and Air Force One, to romantic portrayals of fictional presidents like Dave or The American President. There's a heavy intersectionality with the political sphere and US government operations, without necessarily a specific placement on the political spectrum at the heart of these stories. That's an approach that feels very alien to most politically minded films made today, and it's one that informs Forrest Gump the movie from top to bottom. But before we get any further into Zemeckis and Hank's film, let's jump back to the book. Groom, who was from Alabama and drafted into the Vietnam War, has Gump narrate in the first person with text heavily modified to fit Forrest's southern accent and lower intelligence. Book Forrest has a higher intelligence than the film version, but is still labeled as an idiot savant. And if that term's offensive to you, don't read this book, because it's sure as shit not written for a modern audience. Over the book's 240 pages, Forrest details his extraordinary life, as his massive 6'6", 240-pound frame gets him plucked out of his special education class to play on the high school and then university football team. All the while, Forrest pursues the love of his life, Jenny Curran, who doesn't think much of him, as they play in several bands together and have an on-and-off-again relationship filled with lots of sex. Then it's falling out of college when the team doesn't win a championship, drafted into the Vietnam War where his college best friend Bubba is killed, ping pong in China, and an eventual booming shrimp business. Most of that sounds familiar, right? Well, that's just half the novel. Forrest is arrested many times, mostly due to mishaps and also a protest gone wrong, works at NASA, He is a math, harmonica, and chess whiz, launched into space alongside the first lady astronaut and the wrong orangutan named Sue, who promptly causes the rocket to crash, survives for years on a New Guinea island captured by a cannibal cargo cult, becomes a professional wrestler named the Dunce, is almost cast as the creature from the Black Lagoon in a remake with Raquel Welch, and makes a run for US Senator. So yeah, there's a lot the movie left out, and I think it's obvious why. Groom's book isn't just a full-on satire of America in the mid-century, what with so many US institutions and beliefs made out to be entirely foolish. It's a deeply cynical book as well. Forrest, by both luck and the circumstances of his savant capabilities, is constantly drawn into a new group of people or government body, quickly succeeds at what he's been told to do, and eventually causes that group to go down in flames. Forrest himself is opinionated and flawed, cheating on Jenny and trying to rip off his wrestling manager. Forrest does eventually succeed, as the shrimp company is a massive success. But even then, he's left unfulfilled by the fulfillment of the American dream, leaving it all behind to be a penniless musician drifter alongside Lieutenant Dan, whose spirit is permanently broken in Nam, and Sue the orangutan, Forrest's one true steadfast companion. And I think this is where the very strange blend of nostalgia and cynicism of the film begins, as Roth's script strips out the negativity and stranger elements of the book, but keeps its chronicle of American struggle and strife intact. The movie caused Groom's book to be a belated success, eventually selling more than 2.5 million copies. And I can only imagine that many of those readers were as surprised as I was by how strange the book was in comparison to the movie.
The world will never seem the same once you've seen it through the eyes of Forrest Gump.
Forrest Gump, the movie, begins in 1981 with an adult Forrest telling his life story to anyone that sits next to him at the bus stop, starting in 1951 and tracking 3 decades of American political and societal progress and strife, with a lush Americana feel by cinematographer Don Burgess and sweeping score by composer Alan Silvestri. Along the way, Forrest is witness to the biggest moments that shaped the US during the middle of the 20th century as he moves from one flashpoint to another. Desegregation, the Vietnam War, Watergate, and the many politicians and public figures central to the US during the Cold War. Along the way, Forrest makes his fortune and tries to understand the love of his life, Jenny Curran. Really, what Forrest Gump the movie and Forrest's life as a whole is in pursuit of is the American dream. No, the other American dream. See, while book Forrest's life has failure after failure that he shrugs off, movie Forrest's life is filled with success after success that he pays little attention to. He single-handedly wins football game after football game, graduates from college, enlists in the army instead of being drafted, founds a massively successful shrimp company, and stumbles into money and prosperity everywhere he goes. Mostly because he goes with the flow and does what he's told, like a feather in the wind. If there's anything to definitively distinguish the outlook of Forrest Gump the novel and Forrest Gump the movie, it's in their signature lines. The film's most famous line is, of course,
"My mom always said life was like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're gonna get."
Compare that to the opening line of Groom's novel. Being an idiot is no box of chocolates. People laugh, lose patience, treat you shabby. When released, Gump had as many wide-ranging interpretations as it does now. Critic Roger Ebert loved it and called it a dream of reconciliation for our society, a magical movie. Critic Owen Gleiberman was much more negative, saying the film reduces the tumult of the last few decades to a virtual reality theme park, a baby boomer version of Disney's America. And I think these get to both the central appeal and shortcomings of the film. I love Disneyland, and as I've discussed in various videos before, the experience of this theme park and a lot of Disney media that interfaces with the past of America allows its audience to indulge in an idealized nostalgic vision of the past, full of craftsman homes, beautiful nature, and a harmonious society that is a direct result of the American dream. Like Disneyland, Forrest Gump takes us on a tour through many different aspects of the US, and makes even the scariest times seem enjoyable. There is of course a cynical streak to Gump's structure that we'll get to in a minute, but those aspects often act as a subversion to the main approach of the film. Hank's performance as Forrest glues the movie together, and the movie succeeds because we like Forrest and want good things to happen to him. Of course, having someone portray a character with an intellectual disability who doesn't share the same condition is a hot-button topic when it comes to casting today, but was clearly not something given as much thought in 1994. As for Hanks, I feel like he makes Forrest into such a warm-hearted, likable character, filled with dignity and free of the cliches that many poor portrayals have used over the years, that Gump is still synonymous with what has made him into a massive star.
Is he smart?
He's very smart. He's one of the smartest in his class.
It's not really for me to decide if Hank's portrayal as Forrest is offensive or not. I don't share his condition and don't have anyone in my family that has it either, and I feel as though opinions change from person to person that does share it. Forrest is a cipher for not just the people around him, but the audience itself. Both groups place their own ideas on Forrest, with his late film cross-country run a big indicator of this.
Whoa, man, you just ran through a big pile of dog shit!
It happens.
There's plenty of comedy to be had from Forrest's interactions with the world and people around him, and how he's able to walk through a lot of the most difficult moments in history unscathed and still positive. But I think that the movie kinda admires him.
Jesus H. Christ! This is a new company record.
And while the novel does have Forrest interact with several different real-life figures, it's not nearly as much as the movie. Forrest's intersection with essentially every major American historical moment and figure of the mid-century cements the film's nostalgia. Zemeckis and company use a mix of stand-ins and inserting Hanks into real-life footage to further establish this film's historical fantasy. And how Zemeckis and crew accomplished this is also the major technological selling point of the film. Hanks was shot against blue screen with reference markers for the footage he'd interact with, then chroma keyed and rotoscoped into archival footage, with new lip-sync dialogue from impersonators used for the interactions. Using film grain and TV static helps cover up the imperfections, with some looking better than others, wowing audiences back then along with the blue screen removal of Gary Sinise's legs. Some real trailblazing work at the time. But these historical interactions also highlight the movie's darker edge. There's a refrain of Forrest innocently recounting not just how he met the historical figure, but how they later met a tragic end. Over and over, Zemeckis punctuates Forrest's recollections of the past with outbreaks of violence.
That angry little man at the schoolhouse door thought it'd be a good idea and ran for president. Somebody shot that nice young president when he was riding in his car. And a few years after that, somebody shot his little brother too, only he was in a hotel kitchen. For no particular reason at all, somebody shot him.
Often playing real-life news footage of assassinations as background to Gump's life story. And this is where I think that Gump becomes a slyly cynical critique of America, as we simply accept all the death and destruction as just another day in US history. The closest we get to feeling the toll of war is in the death of Bubba and maiming of Lieutenant Dan. And I think the movie is at its best when it's directly addressing these two men and Forrest, trying to understand their life in Vietnam and its aftermath. Bubba's death is senseless, contrasting Forrest's heroism with his inability to save his best friend. Bubba's last words question the meaning of it all.
Why did this happen?
You got shot. Then, Bubba said something I won't ever forget.
I want to go home.
And Lieutenant Dan's story is a search for that lost meaning. One of the film's funniest moments of dark comedy is the revelation that Dan has had an ancestor die in every major American war, all portrayed by Sinise falling down as stiff as a board on the battlefield. The fact that it's portrayed as kinda aspirational feels like a poke at the ways in which the country valorizes war itself instead of a greater cause. And when Dan loses his legs in combat but is saved from death by Forrest, he hates him for his salvation. I think that Dan's subsequent struggle, most of all his fight with God in a storm, and peaceful swim later, are powerful moments that speak to what it means to have lost all faith in the world and to finally regain it.
He never actually said so, but I think he made his peace with God.
However, nothing speaks to the film's steadfast rejection of a definitive political ideology more than Forrest's speech at a Vietnam protest, or more accurately, lack of speech. After being discharged, Forrest goes to Washington, D.C., only to get mixed up in the massive real-life March on the Pentagon. And just when Forrest is about to talk about his experience in Vietnam, his mic is cut so that no one hears a word. Forrest never tells us what he said, and yeah, that's a pretty big cop-out. In the book, Forrest is asked what he thinks about the war multiple times. His answer? It's a bunch of shit. Simple, but effective.
That's all I have to say about that.
I think the biggest flaw of Gump is that it completely bypasses the civil rights movement, hinted at briefly, but basically left out of the film. And that while the film carries us through times of war, rebellion, counterculture, and activism, it views these as strange fads that ultimately harm their participants. It's not too surprising that Gump himself was seen as a conservative figure, leading a more traditional lifestyle and with simple beliefs that don't go along with the countercultural movements that Jenny partakes in. But it's also important to understand where US culture and politics were in the early 90s. With the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, the US had won the Cold War, marking the most definitive win for the symbol of democracy over communism to date. And while the 90s are seen as one of the least turbulent times in modern America, especially in contrast to the 30 years before, 1994 also saw the occurrence of the Republican Revolution, where the Republican Party led by Newt Gingrich won a massive swing in power during the first midterms under the generally more centrist President Bill Clinton, who was strongly criticized by conservatives even before the Monica Lewinsky scandal. Forrest Gump just so happened to coincide with the Republican Revolution's success and heavy emphasis on family values and the positive aspects of America as the one true world superpower of the time. The National Review named it one of the all-time great conservative movies. Republican presidential candidate Bob Dole even used Forrest Gump as an example of how, no matter how great the adversity, the American dream is within everybody's reach. Of course, that's forgetting that Forrest is a fully fictional character, or all those moments of violence and death that also define the US. But it caused the film to be much more cemented in the minds of people as a conservative text. Although its creators beg to differ. Producer Steve Titch later said, "Forrest Gump isn't about politics or conservative values. It's about humanity. It's about respect, tolerance, and unconditional love." Zemeckis said, "My film is a party to which everyone can bring a bottle." Hank said, "The film is non-political and thus non-judgmental." You know, despite all these political and historical recontextualizations that make Forrest such a head-scratcher when trying to actually understand what this movie is trying to say, Forrest Gump, as a movie, is so well done and so entertaining. It's a comfort watch. This movie is just about the ultimate exercise in nostalgia, and I'll be damned if it doesn't get me nostalgic for not just a time I wasn't alive for, but a time filled with strife, discrimination, hate, and violence. That's because what this movie is saying is that no matter what both Forrest and the country went through during the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, everything turns out alright in the end. I think that's due to the film's outlook at the time when it was made. By the beginning of the 90s, the Cold War had come to an end, the Soviet Union had fallen, and America was prospering. I see a lot of this reflected in the political philosophy book, The End of History and the Last Man, by Francis Fukuyama, published in 1992. Fukuyama, a political scientist, theorized that the history of the world is an evolution that will eventually end with liberal democracy as the final form of government for all nations. And by the early 90s, with the Soviet Union dismantled and liberal democracies on the rise more than ever, this outlook on decades of strife ending and a better world dawning became a popular outlook on how to view everything that came before. Of course, that seems pretty silly 30 years later, but I think that speaks to how almost every political matter is resolved by the film's third act, with the movie instead focusing on its most divisive character, Jenny Curran. Both Forrest Gump the movie and Forrest Gump the book have their narratives largely defined by Forrest's on and off relationship with Jenny. In both, Jenny and Forrest know each other from a young age, but book Jenny is mostly disinterested in Forrest, often using him for her own benefit, bringing him into her band multiple times, forcing him to protest at the Capitol despite him not being interested, and having lots and lots of sex. There's really no tragic backstory to book Jenny, she just kinda sucks. Movie Jenny, played by Robin Wright, also has a tumultuous relationship with Forrest, but she's the second most important character in the story that acts essentially as the dark flip side to Forrest's Forrest's American dream. Movie Jenny is sexually abused by her father repeatedly at a young age, and is trapped in that abuse for years.
Dear God, make me a bird so I can fly far, far, far away from here. Dear God, make me a bird so I can fly far.
Jenny is traumatized and seeks out anything and everything to ease her pain. Movie Jenny is the total representation of American counterculture. Drugs, protests, hippie movement, Black Panthers, and more are all attached to Robin Wright's character, spiraling deeper and deeper across the decades, while Forrest succeeds. Jenny having sex with Forrest feels way worse in the movie, too. Where's the consent? In both versions, Jenny has a boy and Forrest finds out he's the father. In the book, Jenny is married, has lied about her husband being the dad, and lets Forrest meet him briefly before saying goodbye forever. In the film, Jenny and Forrest get married and Forrest takes on a father role before Jenny dies from a mysterious disease, apparently intended to be hepatitis C, but often thought of as AIDS. The result is that the movie gives the couple a brief happy ending before essentially punishing Jenny for everything she's done. It's sad and sweet and very troubling. In the end, Jenny pays with her life for the counterculture movement after its reconciliation to the mainstream. In the years that followed Gump's success, Winston Groom went on to write a book sequel, Gump & Co., that was poorly received but whose rights licensing got him the money that Paramount's shady accounting never did. And while Hanks and Zemeckis considered making the sequel into a movie, talks quickly died. Eric Roth said a sequel, which would have killed Forrest's Native American girlfriend in the Oklahoma City bombing and made Forrest Jr. HIV positive, I'm not kidding, I turned in the script the night before 9/11. And we sat down, Tom Hanks and Bob Zemeckis and I, looked at each other and said, we don't think this is relevant anymore. The world had changed. I think that speaks to how that seemingly idealized moment that made Forrest Gump what it is has been lost forever. Whether or not people in the 90s were right to believe that things had turned out alright, I can't see another year from that point on where anyone would believe so. What would a movie like Forrest Gump look like now? The 30 years since the first would include 9/11, the War on Terror, Columbine, Hurricane Katrina, many political scandals, COVID, and nu metal. It seems impossible to tell the story of a man happily blowing his way through all those events. And what the film chooses to leave out would likely ruffle as many feathers as what it chooses to show. When it comes down to how Gump has been interpreted in so many ways, including it being both a political lightning rod and an apolitical comfort watch, I'm reminded of author Toni Morrison's quote, "All good art is political. There is none that isn't. And the ones that try hard not to be political are political by saying, we love the status quo." I'm not interested in art that is not in the world. And it's not just the narrative. It's not just the story. It's the language and the structure and what's going on behind it. Anybody can make up a story. The thing about Gump is that it's so deeply embedded in the world and gives us the chance to look back knowing what's happened instead of looking forward uncertain of what's to come. I'd say that Zemeckis' movie is even more political than Groom's book. And yet, for Forrest, life carries on with the hope that things will be better for his son. That's a comforting thought, and the idea that we could look back at the last 30 years of our own history and see that it all worked out in the end is wonderful. I'd hope that we can all be so happy when we look back at our own pasts too, but it seems harder than ever. Thanks for watching today's video, and I think maybe this is a very offbeat topic for the channel, even though my focus on historical context and many different interpretations of the same source material is something that I really love to cover in the videos that I do here on the channel. But to me, Forrest Gump has always been a fascinating piece of nostalgia. When I saw it as a little kid, I just really loved it, and didn't really understand the most inappropriate moments of the film. But my parents loved it, and my grandparents loved it, and it seemed like everybody that I knew loved this movie too. In the years that followed, I saw Forrest Gump's reputation slowly change. And I feel as though when you talk about this movie these days, you often get the most negative interpretations possible of it. And I really do get that, but I think that this movie is more complicated and honestly mostly mixed up than most people seem to give it credit for. I think to a certain degree, Forrest Gump the movie doesn't really know what it wants to say. So it says a lot of different things and refuses to take a side, and because of that has been interpreted in a lot of different ways. So hopefully this video was able to walk through those many different interpretations and give credit to a lot of different ways this movie can be seen. And even though I picked this movie apart in my research and analysis, I still find it to be a really enjoyable comfort watch that is just absolutely loaded with nostalgia, for both good and bad. You really can't deny the high level of craftsmanship in all areas of this movie's production, and I think that's why it has endured to some degree. And now, with the 30th anniversary of Forrest Gump upon us, I think that this movie is ripe for its own nostalgic reappraisal, because nostalgia really does move in 30-year cycles, which is really why the narrative of Forrest Gump was created in the structure that it had. I'd love to hear your thoughts about Forrest Gump, your favorite nostalgia movies, as well as your favorite 90s political thrillers, because I have really wanted to do a video on 90s political thrillers for a while now. It's a really fascinating and specific subject. So if you'd like to see that, let me know. As always, a huge thank you to my patrons for their continued support. And if you'd like to be a patron, it's only $1 a month for early access to every video and exclusive Patreon-only podcast reviews. We're still going through Miyazaki Madness, and the latest episodes cover Kiki's Delivery Service and Porco Rosso. So until next time, I hope that you're taking care of yourselves and enjoying a box of chocolates.